Coming up on Jerusalem Dateline, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu says Israel will fight with its nails if it has to, after President Biden says the U.S. will halt certain ammunition if Israel attacks deeper into Rafah. Are civilian deaths in Gaza being used as a propaganda tool? Some say yes. And suing advocacy groups that instigated protests on U.S. university campuses to use as a second battlefront by Hamas. All this and more coming up on this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. Israeli leaders responded to President Joe Biden's announcement that the U.S. will stop supplying certain ammunition for Israel's operation to defeat Hamas in Rafah. It represents a watershed moment in Israel's history. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had already promised earlier this week that if Israel had to go it alone in its war against Hamas, they would go it alone. After President Joe Biden said he would withhold key weapons if Israel launched a major operation in Rafah, Netanyahu repeated his pledge on the eve of the nation's Independence Day.
In the War of Independence 76 years ago, we were few against many. We had no weapons. There was an arms embargo on Israel, but with the greatness of spirit, bravery, and unity among us, we won. Today, we're much stronger. We're determined, and we're united to defeat our enemy and those who seek our souls. If we have to stand alone, we will stand alone. I've already said that if we have to, we will fight with our fingernails. But we have much more than fingernails, and with the same greatness of spirit, with God's help, we will win together.
Despite Biden's partial weapons embargo, IDF's chief spokesman said the military has what it needs to finish the job.
The Army has munitions for the missions it has planned, and for the missions in Rafah too. We have what we need. I say this in the context of everything that happened with the United States, and it's important to say it.
IDF Reserve Lieutenant Colonel Eyal Dror told CBN News Biden's move helps Hamas.
Unfortunately, the war will be longer because Hamas took courage from this decision. He said, hey, the U.S. is against Israel now, so we can continue not to allow release the kidnapped. It means that more people will probably be hit because Israel will have to do more force in order to make Hamas agree these agreements.
Dror says the Middle East is watching.
The Middle East is not just Israel and Hamas. Everything. I remind you that the Middle East is still remembering what happened with the withdrawal of the U.S. from Afghanistan. It was just 2 years ago. And the U.S., in their opinion, betrayed the allies. Now it's the same message.
Biden also facing criticism in Washington from both Democrats and Republicans, with some conservatives telling the administration it is aiding Hamas.
Hamas's leaders and its last 4 battalions are holed up in Rafah. So Israel has to defeat Hamas in Rafah to win. Hamas wins if it survives in Rafah. And Joe Biden has threatened to withhold weapons from Israel for fighting in Rafah. Therefore, Joe Biden objectively favors a Hamas victory over Israel.
Israel is also looking ahead to what could be the next war against Hezbollah, as Defense Minister Yoav Gallant reinforced to the troops Israel's goals of destroying the terrorist group, telling troops this could be a hot summer. But for now, the focus is finishing off Hamas and Rafah, as Israeli forces are taking out terrorists and keeping up their offensive in Gaza. Israel is downplaying the threat of President Biden's threat, saying they can go it alone in Rafah. Here's what Biden said in his interview with CNN.
I made it clear that if they go into Rafah, they haven't gone into Rafah yet. If they go into Rafah, I'm not supplying the weapons that have been used historically to deal with Rafah, to deal with the cities, to deal with that problem. We're going to continue to make sure Israel is secure in terms of Iron Dome and their ability to respond to attacks like came out of the Middle East recently. But it's just wrong. We're not going to supply the weapons and the artillery shells used that have been used.
Artillery shells as well.
Yeah, artillery shells.
I'm joined by CBN Middle East analyst John Wagi to talk more about the impact of the U.S. warning to Israel John, what impact is this going to have here in Israel?
Well, I think, Chris, the important thing to remember is President Biden, I think in Biden's mind, he really does have an ironclad relationship with Israel. He's got one small problem, and that is that Israelis elected and have elected since 2009 Benjamin Netanyahu. And Biden and his administration have been clear they want Netanyahu out. And so each step along the way, and now it's come to withholding military ammunition, bombs, because they're doubling down on this effort to get rid of Netanyahu. And anymore, they're not even making a secret about it.
Yeah.
And so that's their political target, but they still have to deal with an Israel the nation is essentially behind Netanyahu in finishing the job in Rafah. He doesn't really have much choice. He knows that the country has to eliminate this threat. And so you have the clash of the two capitals, Washington and Jerusalem. It's not a total clash of capitals because the Congress, many people in the Congress of the United States are siding with Israel against the Biden administration. And so we're going to keep having this clash until one side or the other gives. And it appears Israel's ready to make the move and continue it through to the end in Rafah.
Yeah, and as we saw Tom Cotton in our report, and also Lindsey Graham had a fiery confrontation with Floyd Austin, the defense secretary.
And both leaders in the House and Senate for the Republicans have written an open letter to Biden basically asking him to explain and give a timetable for when Israel is going to be resupplied, and if they're not going to be, tell the Congress.
Yeah.
And so a lot going on. From the military side, Chris, I know you've been in touch with a couple high-level people.
Yeah.
And what was their reaction to the military side of things?
Well, I was talking to Yaakov Amidor. He's a retired general, but he's a former head of the IDF military intelligence. He was saying it's not just Rafah, but actually the more important issue is what's going on in the north. He believes they have enough musicians to deal with the operation in Rafah, but the question is, do they have enough munitions to deal with a far greater enemy, Hezbollah, on the north? And also Jonathan Conricus was telling me that it really has a chilling effect on the IDF, its movements and its supplies. But medium and longer term is, will Israel be able to depend on the United States? And will strategically they start to look to other countries, other sources of weapons and supplies that they can depend on?
And it's interesting, Chris, because both Benjamin Netanyahu and some analysts on the conservative side have been saying for years Israel has to wean itself from the total dependence on the United States. So it's not like they're looking for a handout every single time. They're looking for a way to build themselves up so they don't have to depend on an administration that's run afoul.
Yeah, we looked at the political issue, the military issue. Talk about the spiritual issue. Just about a minute left. What does this mean spiritually for the United States?
Well, I think what's happened now is Israel is squarely in the heart of the 2024 presidential election. And so this isn't going to get any neater and cleaner for Americans. This is going to become an issue on which people vote. People come to the polls. And now Biden finds himself aligned with the Squad and with now Chuck Schumer as well, all on the side that is pretty much vehemently anti-Israel, and I don't know how they're going to pull themselves back from that. But the Biden campaign needs to walk a fine line because they still depend on Jewish donors, Jewish foot soldiers, and there's the Jewish people in America are getting more and more concerned about the rank anti-Semitism in all these protests and everything. So it's not going to be a cool, calm summer.
Yeah, probably. And a great incentive for many Christians around the world to be praying.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you, John.
Thanks.
Coming up, are civilian death tolls in Gaza being used as a propaganda tool? Some say yes. Civilians caught in the crossfire during battle are often described as a consequence of war. While we have seen this during the war in Gaza between Israel and Hamas, some analysts say reporting of civilian deaths in this conflict is being used as a propaganda tool. Take a look. Tragically, Palestinians have died in the more than 200-day war Hamas began on October 7th.
Of course, we have to start by saying that every human being whose life is lost is a terrible tragedy, and we're all created in the image of God.
Gil Huffman, director of Honest Reporting, a media watchdog group, recently published an investigative report on how Hamas has inflated the number of civilian casualties in Gaza.
Terrorists are not journalists. They're not people who should be trusted. And their numbers that they're putting out are part of their propaganda game to try to win the world's sympathy, and it's unfortunately working.
The Gaza Health Ministry, overseen by Hamas, publishes those numbers. Currently, its death toll reporting stands at more than 34,000. Huffman says those numbers have been parroted throughout the war by world leaders, including President Biden and global media like the Associated Press.
You know, the world media, they try to be balanced. So Israel says this. Israel says that based on the studies taken by the world's top experts on urban warfare, Israel set a gold standard in preventing the loss of civilian life. So they put out our side. And then the other side, they put out, well, Hamas says that Israel is committing genocide. It doesn't work that way. You don't trust a democratic government that's the top ally of the United States the same way you trust a terror organization.
Professor of Statistics Abraham Weiner from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania wrote how the Gaza Ministry of Health fakes casualty numbers. The data scientist studied Hamas statistics from the war's beginning using a graph and concluded, here's the problem with this data. The numbers are not real. That much is obvious to anyone who understands how naturally occurring numbers work. The casualties are not overwhelmingly women and children, and the majority may be Hamas fighters. This data also does not include the estimated 13,000 Hamas fighters killed in combat or Palestinians killed by misfired rockets, estimated by some to be less than 1,000. The Foundation for the Defense of Democracies also reported this month that the Gaza Health Ministry cannot provide names for more than 10,000 it says have died.
We previously knew they had incomplete records for this set of people of at least 10,000, but from both Wall Street Journal reporting and from an item on the ministry's own social media feed, they've indicated they don't have names, so they can't really identify these individuals. It's really one more drop in a bucket on a broader credibility issue.
Asdenik also noted the Gaza Ministry of Health got its information from unidentified, quote, reliable media sources.
At first, that was only about 22%, but then it became an increasing percentage over time. So we got to a point where nearly 45% of the alleged deceased were based on these media reports.
It's not the only example of suspected death tolls. Near the beginning of the war, the media reported Israel killed 500 at the Al-Ahli hospital. Later, it was discovered a misfired rocket by Islamic Jihad killed far less civilians in the next-door parking lot. Abu Shlouf, the spokesperson for Islamic Jihad, admitted it was a lie.
Yes, in order to erase this story, the organization made several moves. It fabricated a story that the rocket belonged to the occupation and the target was a hospital building. They relied on some of the stories of the international press.
And after that, they published it to the whole world?
Yes.
First of all, I acknowledge that sadly, there are civilians, non-combatants that have been killed in battle. Sadly. And that is not the intention of the IDF. I think the IDF has gone to tremendous lengths in order to minimize the amount of non-combatants that have been affected by this war. And I, as a human being, I regret any civilian who loses his life as a part of a fight that they didn't start.
Former IDF spokesman Jonathan Conricus, now with the FDD, says Hamas has rigged the battlefield.
We must remember who embeds himself within the civilian population and abuses everything that is supposed to be protected under international law. Hospitals, schools, mosques, UN facilities, infirmaries, and everything else. The organization that does that is Hamas. And had Hamas chosen to fight out in the open, and not to use civilians as human shields, not to tunnel underneath civilian neighborhoods, and not to hide behind civilian infrastructure, then of course there wouldn't be any civilian casualties.
Despite Hamas using human shields, According to military historian John Spencer, the ratio of civilian deaths to combatants is near historic lows for urban warfare.
The fact that there are civilian casualties is an unfortunate result of Hamas's strategy and tactics, and IDF is still applying the principles of distinction and proportionality. It tries to strike only the military assets, and it tries to strike with just enough force in order to get the military job done.
Even so, Huffman says, regrettably, the charge of genocide has spread worldwide into the streets and across social media.
That ridiculous accusation for a war that started with the Hamas sending people into Israel to kill as many Jews as they could, and Israel doing everything possible to minimize civilian deaths. And unfortunately, that accusation is still out there, and that's just anti-Semitic to accuse Israel of that when the facts are just so obvious to be the opposite.
Up next, suing advocacy groups that have instigated protests on U.S. university campuses as a second battlefront for Hamas.
A lawsuit is being filed against two U.S. groups which follow Hamas's ideology that are fueling the pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel protests on U.S. university campuses. I spoke with attorney Arsen Ostrovsky about how these groups are behind much of the violence we're seeing. Arsen, thanks for being with us. You're part of a legal battle right now in the U.S., and you filed a lawsuit in the U.S. Tell us about the lawsuit.
Sure. I mean, look, the lawsuit has been filed against the group National Students for Justice in Palestine and AMP, American Muslims for Palestine. Now, these groups are the primary drivers of what we're seeing today happening across campuses in the United States, which have effectively become a second front for Hamas since October 7. And these groups, they're not mere advocacy organizations, but they are the campus arm of the Hamas terror group. They are acting and serving in collaboration and coordination with Hamas, essentially as propagandists and collaborators on campus to try and promote the Hamas extremist ideology, to justify their actions and to incite the vitriol, the hatred and the violence that we're seeing on campuses today.
So they're part of the fuel of what's actually happening right now in college campuses?
Absolutely. They are not only part of the fuel, they are the ones pouring fuel on the fire of what we're seeing on campuses across America today. On October 7th, when the massacre happened, Hamas called to mobilize into action. The very next day, SJP and the national chapters across America answered that call. They created a toolkit or a manifesto echoing the very terminology, the very directives that were issued by Hamas across campuses in the United States, and that has led not only to the violence, incitement and hatred that we're seeing against Jewish students on campuses, but also importantly, it has created the space and the narrative necessary for Hamas to continue carrying out the acts of terror they are doing here against Israelis and also in the holding of hostages and captives in Gaza, including also American nationals.
So you're saying the day after October 7th, October 8th, Hamas worked together with these groups?
Correct. Hamas issued a call to action, and the very next day, SJP and their affiliates throughout the United States, they answered that call, they answered that directive, they created a toolkit, a manifesto for their chapters across the United States, echoing the language, the terminology, the instructions by the Hamas terror group, and propagated that across campuses.
And you also have people from that were damaged on October 7th as part of the plaintiffs, is that right?
Correct. There are 9 plaintiffs, including Americans and Israelis as well, and these plaintiffs include victims of survivors of the Nova massacre. They include those that have been displaced, and they also include family members of those that have been massacred by Hamas.
Yeah. What impact do you hope this lawsuit has?
Quite frankly, we want to shut down SJP. SJP is a primary arm of Hamas on campuses across the United States. They're the ones fomenting the hatred, the anti-Semitism, the harassment of Jewish students. We need to shut them down, and we can do that legally by branding them as a terrorist organization, as a collaborator of the Hamas terror group, and making sure once and for all they cannot be active on campus. And in addition to that, also providing some semblance of justice to the victims of the Hamas terror attacks who have been deeply affected by the actions of SJP and AMP on campuses in the US.
Israel is fighting a battle on a number of fronts, and the Gaza Strip and Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iran itself. You're in the legal battle. What is that like, and why is it so important?
Israel, as you said, we're fighting on multiple battlefronts, not only in the ground in Gaza, but also fighting in the legal arena. And today what we're seeing is that the state of Israel is being demonized and vilified and delegitimized and painted as a pariah, where we're seeing the international law not only being misused, but being turned into an act of lawfare against us for the simple act of defending our citizens, trying to bring back our captives. We need to change this paradigm, and we need to hold not only the perpetrators, the Hamas, accountable, but all those that enable, support, aid, abet, and fund them. And that is how we're using the law to go after all those who are supporting Hamas. And we will hold them accountable, and we will do that through the courts.
Yeah. Arsen Ostrowski, great to be with you.
Thank you.
Still ahead, a young family finds a new life in Israel with help and support from CBN partners.
In chapter 19 of the book of Leviticus, it talks about caring for the stranger among us, even loving them like ourselves. And thanks to the help of CBN partners, immigrant families like the one in our next story are finding their way in their new home, Israel.
Alex was a police officer in Russia before the war with Ukraine began. Because of his Jewish heritage, he decided to move to Israel with his wife and their toddler.
We never anticipated that the situation in Russia would become what it is today. We were very stressed and concerned that Alex might be conscripted and sent to war.
I did not see a future for myself and my family in Russia. I want my children to grow up with opportunities for education, with a brighter and happier future.
Starting a new life in Israel presented many challenges for the couple. Money was tight, and Alex and Ginia scrambled to find opportunities.
After we managed to escape Russia and come to Israel, things were very tough. Everything was new to us. We didn't know the language. We were desperate at first, but we were really surprised by how amazing, how kind and helpful people are here.
We had nothing. Buying furniture and household appliances was not possible for us. We barely had enough money for basic needs.
Then one day, a Ukrainian refugee helped Alex while at the grocery store. Their friendship grew, and he told Alex about CBN Israel. Alex and his family got connected to CBN Israel, and thanks to supporters like you, we made it possible for Alex and his family to receive the help they needed.
The help CBN provided is truly great for our family, because we are in a very tough position. My wife is a doctor. She is learning Hebrew and doing courses. That will allow her to work in the future. We couldn't afford to send our son to daycare, so I have to be with him while my wife is studying, and then I go to work in the evenings.
Because of your kind support, CBN Israel helped Alex's family to get ahead. Now they feel like there's hope for the future.
The fear is gone now that we know that we're not alone. We're very thankful. Your support is invaluable. Thank you so much.
Your organization has been a great help. Thank you.
Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and you can access CBN content through our CBN News and other CBN apps. And please continue to pray for Israel at this critical moment. And here are a few hostages to pray for by name: Omer Ventkert, Omer Nutra, Abraham Munda, Agam Berger, and Alexander Lobanov. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.